Chapter 11, Construction Management. In this section, we're going to be talking about the functions of construction management and overseeing a home project and reviewing some of those requirements, property standards, talking about actions that may need to be taken throughout the life of that project on that. So let's get started and talk a little bit about the home regulations, the standards that are put in place. So the home program put property standards in place to make sure that each of the properties that were assisted with home funds were going to meet some minimum standards of, being appropriate for housing, that they would be functional for those households, be safe. And as part of that, this is the process on how we determine what improvements are going to be necessary. So whether that is the standard that new construction is going to be built to, or what are all of the elements in the scope of work for a property that we're going to be rehabilitating to bring it up to standards. And as those of you that have done this kind of work before, particularly on a owner rehabilitation, you're going to have an owner walking around that property with you with a lot of ideas on how the home fund should be expended on their property. Your codes and standards, your written rehabilitation standards are going to be a guide for you in determining what are all the things that need to be included, what things might be eligible to be included, and also knowing what things does the home program not going to pay for. As part of this, we're also laying out what we expect as far as the quality of the materials, how things are going to be installed. So we're trying to make sure that we are getting a good product for our investment of home funds, that it's going to hold up to use, and that it's going to be a good value in the long run. And so to do that, particularly in a competitive environment where folks are trying to have the lowest bid so that they can win the work, we need to make sure that we're pretty specific on what we expect as far as materials and installation for that. You need to refer to the different chapters for each of the eligible activities, which will talk specifically about the property standards that apply for each of those activities. And as you may recall, they're oftentimes broken out between, is this just acquisition? Are we doing acquisition along with rehab? Is this new construction? So it may be different depending on the type of project that we're undertaking. So we have a number of things that are going to apply. Our housing codes are going to set in place what those minimum standards would be in to allow a unit to be occupied. These also set what we consider to be minimum health and safety conditions. And so if we had anything that was a violation of our health and safety conditions, we would say that that unit can't be occupied until those issues have been dealt with, and sometimes on an emergency basis or right up front before we would continue with the rest of the rehabilitation. These codes are in place to protect folks, to make sure that they're not living in places that are unsafe, unsanitary. ADFA has also required that its projects follow the multifamily housing minimum design standards. And so when we are funding the creation of new units or rehabilitating units, we want to bring them up to some basic standards on this. In cases where there's something unique to your particular multifamily project design that you believe needs to be done in a different way or cannot meet these standards, you would need to work with ADFA and receive a waiver specifically from these minimum design standards to be able to do something that did not line up with what these were requiring. So as we mentioned, the building codes create the minimum standards for the work that's going to be performed. And so there are state and local standards that are going to apply. Included in that are things like fire, electric, plumbing codes that would be part of that. ADFA, in trying to create appropriate minimum standards, has put the ADFA codes in place to be mandatory statewide. Now keep in mind, in the local community that you're working in, you may have some local codes, and in some cases they may be more stringent than the ADFA code. You, of course, will have to comply with the more stringent code. The ADFA code set sort of a minimal standard, but in some cases you will have a higher standard that you will have to document. So those rehabilitation codes provide a guide on how you're going to address those existing structures. In some cases, with your initial inspections on properties, you're going to be trying to determine, with the funding that you have available for that property, can it be brought up to the required standards and codes within the funding that you have available. And so in some cases, the determination may be that that's a property that cannot be assisted unless there are other funds that are provided. That might be that the owner of the property has the ability to provide some additional funding. There may be another local funding source that can fill that gap. But to be able to commit home funds to a property, we have to be able to determine what is the scope of work that's going to be needed to bring the property to standards, and an estimate, essentially, of what that cost will be. So as part of that, we would be looking to Appendix J of the International Residential Code minimum requirements. It's really similar to a building code, but it's put in place to set a standard for existing properties as opposed to for new construction. The rehabilitation standards also outline about quality of materials, about the workmanship. So it might be, for instance, we might have a standard that we were going to use a 3-tab shingle and a particular weight of underlayment that would be installed. We might specify the kind of installation, so whether that was stapling or nailing. We might have a requirement about how many nails were going to be used so that we have a product that is well installed, is going to hold up with wind and wear over time. And so that's how we lay out what the methods and materials are that are going to be required to be eligible for that home payment. And part of our inspection, interim inspections, while construction is occurring, is to make sure that the materials that are actually being used on that project and the installation methodologies that you're observing happening on that site are within the requirements that you've laid out for that particular project. So HUD itself, the home program, requires that ADFA have written rehabilitation standards in place. And some of the things that are required to be included in those written rehabilitation standards include defining what health and safety issues are. And so defining what those sort of minimum standards for a unit to be considered occupiable, what would need to be addressed. We mentioned, as we went through property standards in other chapters, that also laying out what a minimum useful life would be for major systems. Generally, HUD is going to require that to be a minimum of 5 years. As part of ADFA's written rehabilitation standards, they also have defined what would be considered a life-threatening deficiency and something that would have to be addressed immediately when we had an occupied unit. ADFA's written rehabilitation standards also include the lead paint rule requirements. And so these are covering structures that are pre-1978. And so those properties may contain lead. And so that triggers the requirement for appropriate risk assessments to be done to determine the level of lead hazard in that property, and then specifying the level of treatment that would be required, whether that's as simple as lead-safe work practices on some minimal disturbing of painted surfaces, all the way up to complete abatement for that unit. The written rehabilitation standards also include accessibility requirements. So for folks that are mobility or sensory impaired, standards that those properties are going to be built to make sure that they are visitable, that they are habitable for those folks. And then HUD also requires the disaster mitigation standards to be included. So for instance, Arkansas has a lot of tornadoes, and so we may have building code standards in place about using things like clips to try to make sure that roofs don't blow off in tornadic winds. Those sorts of standards would be incorporated within ADFA's written rehabilitation standards. And so the written rehabilitation standards are going to apply anytime we're working on an existing structure. So whether that's owner-occupied homeowner rehabilitation, a rental project where we are rehabbing existing rental units or maybe converting them to be rental units. But it also would be applying when we have home buyer projects that we are providing purchase assistance and rehab for those units. We'd have to make sure that those standards were applied as part of putting the standards for that project in place. So the write-up for that property and identifying what the scope of work would include would need to bring it into compliance not only with the codes and standards that are in place, but also with the written rehabilitation standards. So that's something that as a recipient that's running a program or overseeing a specific project, you would need to be aware of, and that would be part of that scope of work development, but also a contractor that's going to be completing the work, or if we have a nonprofit in that role, they would need to be knowledgeable about what was going to be required for that project based on the written rehabilitation standards. So here's just a graphic to kind of help sort out what applies. For both rehabilitation and new construction, we've got state and local codes, but we also have universal design criteria and the Section 504 requirements, which are for handicap accessibility. Now, keep in mind, 504 applies for new construction, but also for substantial rehabilitation in a property that has 15 or more units. And we define substantial rehabilitation as our rehabilitation cost is at least 75% of the replacement value for that property. So if we were doing a really large scale rehab of a property, an existing property with 15 or more units, we also could be required to have those set-asides under Section 504 for mobility impaired and sensory impaired. So we would have some of our particular units built to those standards. For our rehabilitation projects, we're going to have our written rehabilitation standards, the UPCS, the Uniform Physical Condition Standards, and then for rental housing that's 26 or more units, we do have a capital needs assessment trying to determine what are the requirements for capital over that affordability period and determining whether we have adequate reserves or whether we need to adjust that scope of work to be able to reduce some of those capital needs. We want to make sure that our projects are sustainable. For new construction, it's the ICC, Residential Code, International Building Code, and the Energy Conservation Code, along with, we mentioned in the rental section about our site and neighborhood standards when we're making choices about where we're going to locate our new rental housing projects and what those will look like. We'll mention later when we go through the other federal requirements that we have sort of a layering of other federal requirements which have an impact on managing our construction projects. We could have Davis-Bacon wage rates. We'll have environmental review. We might have a project that had Uniform Relocation Act where we were either permanently or temporarily displacing individuals. And so if you look at an exhibit in the chapter 11-2, there's some good information here about thinking about all those other federal requirements, the timing on those, and the potential impact on that. And then 11-3 is providing some documentation and thinking through what's the kind of documentation that I'm going to need to have in place to show that I'm in compliance with those other federal requirements. Let's talk a little bit about inspections and the specifications. So I've talked a lot about it. I keep coming back to those specifications. They're so key in our construction project because this is really laying out what is it that we're paying for? What is it that we're expecting to be done on this unit, whether it's new construction, whether it's rehabilitation, and so at completion, what do we expect this unit to look like? And that's going to be the basis not only for the procurement that we talked about in Chapter 10, but it's also as part of that construction management. This is part of that agreement, written agreement with the contractor on this is what we're hiring you to do. These are the specifications. This is what you're going to use as part of your inspections to make sure that they have been completed. So as detailed as they can be will help not only with communication, but also to ensure that you actually get what you were expecting and what was needed for this project to be in compliance with our property standards. So as much as possible, if you can include things like drawings, sometimes are really helpful so that everybody understands with a little bit of visual help on what we're expecting, what it should look like, where it should be placed, how some of these things align with each other. And then, you know, you could include in part of that sometimes in reference materials. In some cases, we're going to specify a particular application. We might be specifying particular materials or an equivalent, and so we might want to provide some additional information on, you know, what is that item that we're talking about or designating in our scope of work? What would that equivalent have to meet to be considered equivalent? The plans need to be submitted to ADFA. They will be reviewing these. They will have the final approval on these. So obviously, the more information and the more easily understood that they can be, the faster that process can work and with less callbacks on needing additional clarification. So as part of the oversight in construction management, there need to be progress inspections. Sometimes this is simply to make sure that a contractor is actually showing up, is on the job and working. As I mentioned, that's also an opportunity when you are inspecting, stopping by on that site to make sure that they are using the materials that were specified, that they're actually installing them in the way that you expect to have those installed. Timing on that can be really critical. There are going to be points in a project where we have walls that are open and we can really kind of see what's been done and if there are any other issues that perhaps we had not been able to identify when we completed that initial inspection to determine the scope of work. So our inspections are required before all draws. And so before a contractor can be paid for work that's completed, that inspection has to be completed to look at that scope of work that they are saying we're eligible to be paid to make sure it's been completed and that it meets those specifications. That needs to be done before each draw. Generally, these will also be done at prescribed intervals. We may, as part of the timeline for that project, have set some milestones in place. So it might be, as I mentioned, when walls are open, maybe before drywalling occurs, that we want to be able to go in and look at plumbing, electric, HVAC installs that have been done to make sure before they're covered up that things appear to be correctly done. Also, if there's going to be a request for a change order, there needs to be an inspection done to verify the reason for this change order, that you agree with it, that the proposed change to the scope of work is going to be appropriate. Sometimes we're going to get complaints that come in from the owner of the property, maybe a tenant. Sometimes neighbors or others, concerned citizens, are going to be calling and complaining or raising issues about a project. As part of good construction management, You need to be responsive to that, going to the site, talking with the partners that are involved in this to try to determine whether there's an issue that you need to intercede on. And you would have good documentation in your file to show not only that, yes, you're being responsive and overseeing that, but sometimes of what was agreed, who said what, so that you kind of clarified what actions and what you expect to happen from that. There would be code inspections. So depending on the scope of work, we'll determine what inspections will need to be done. And then nothing better than unannounced, to simply stop by and see, is anything happening on that site? I can't tell you the number of times I've accompanied a construction manager who took me to a site to show me a project that was underway, only to discover that there was not a soul on that site. And so when contractors know that you are going to be stopping by unannounced, it kind of puts them on call that they need to make sure that that project continues to move forward, and you may be there at any point. One thing that is recommended, it's optional, not a requirement, is that there be a 10-month review inspection. So we're going to be talking about the fact that there is a 12-month warranty on projects. And so the suggestion being that you as the recipient who are overseeing projects or programs, that you make a practice of making an inspection at about the 10-month time period to determine, are there any issues that had not been captured in that original scope of work? Are there any warranty items where there are issues on this? So that sort of window of opportunity is closing with the warranty that the contractor would have in place, but also there's a home rule that says there is the opportunity up to 1 year after completion of the project to add additional home funds. So, you know, if we were to stop by that property and realize that there was something that for function or safety or maybe for longevity of the property that really needs to be addressed, we would still have that opportunity in the 10th month to be able to go back to ADFA, and they could choose to add some additional home funds to that project. More likely is a situation where we're finding that something that was completed by the contractor under that existing scope of work isn't holding up, there's a quality issue or durability, and we would, under that warranty period, still have the ability to call back that contractor and require them to correct what you know the issue was. So that 10-month timing, not required, optional, but is kind of a best practice. The final inspection on the property, so we said that all home properties, when they're completed, need to meet all of the applicable standards, and so ADFA needs to be able to ensure that each of these properties meet that standard. So for the final inspection, it's going to be conducted by the ADFA inspector along with the owner, the contractor, and the recipient on that. So as part of this, it's to make sure that all of those codes and standards have been completed to verify that this property now meets standards. That also includes if there were any punch list items that had previously been identified, those have to have been completed before we can essentially call this a final inspection and that the project is done. So this is ADFA's on-site making sure that we have the project completion. As part of that, we must be distributing some necessary documents. So things like warranties, operating information will be provided on this. Things that will be talked about at that point would be making sure that everybody is signing off saying, yes, I accept this work, we agree that it meets the standards, everything's fine. In some cases, this is at the point when that insurance coverage that the contractor had been maintaining during the construction period or developer is now going to be ended, and the insurance coverage needs to be transferred to the owner's responsibility on that. Along with that, sometimes we're going to have some transfer of utilities now that construction has been completed. This final inspection triggers the beginning of that warranty period. So our standard would be 12 months as part of this, and it's one of the essential things to be able to be eligible for the final payment on that project. A punch list is essentially a list identified by the recipient's inspector, might be from an architect, after going through when we're pretty close to the final and coming up with a final list of items that need to be completed. With that, it's really recommended that you have a timeline with that. Otherwise, these things can linger on for quite a while. We have an architect on the project. We're going to require them to issue a notice of substantial completion. And the recipient then needs to be overseeing this, making sure that the work has been completed, that the project is now compliant, and that's when they would be notifying ADFA that the project is now ready for that final inspection that ADFA would be coming on site to be able to do. For closing out our construction phase, we've finally gotten everything completed. That contractor is going to be providing the cost certification. So we can track and certify the costs on that job, the warranties for work that would be performed, along with operating manuals, manufacturing guarantees, those sorts of things would be provided as part of our closeout process on this. And then, of course, those release of liens will need to all be in place for all of our suppliers, subcontractors, and the general contractor, so that we know that before we release any of our retainage, that all of those liabilities, financial liabilities for that project have been resolved. We mentioned about a warranty inspection. It just is ensuring that that contractor's workmanship and materials are holding up. And again, all through this process, as the recipient who is overseeing the construction process, you're going to want to keep detailed notes about the progress, the timing on this project, about any kind of deficiencies or issues that would relate to working with that contractor. We mentioned in the procurement chapter that we could eliminate a bid in procurement if we deemed that contractor not to be responsible. And one of those elements would be that we have a contractor that has a track record of deficiencies with the kind of work that they were doing or the timeliness on that work. And so keeping that kind of documentation would be essential to be able to implement some kind of a responsibility evaluation with those bids that are coming in. The warranty inspection, again, it could be conducted by ADFA, and it would be based on the 11 months after the start of that warranty period. Talk a little bit about our contractors. We're really going to depend on having an adequate supply of skilled contractors who have a good track record on getting the work done, having it done appropriately. And so we're trying to make sure that we screen our contractors that we're going to allow into our pool. So we're going to advertise as widely to try to attract contractors who are going to want to participate in our program. So we're going to be, when we're doing our procurement, we're going to be putting out notices about bids. We want to make sure that we have a healthy pool of contractors who are going to bid and create a competitive environment. As part of that, we need to be working with them on making sure that the plans and specifications are very clear. As they have questions, we need to be able to provide clarification. Our goal here is to make sure that we get an adequate number of sealed bids that are coming in from those contractors and are coming from contractors that we've been able to work with that are responsive and responsible in their bidding on this. As part of this, we might be negotiating bids that are exceeding the project budget. Many times we're going to have to send our bid packets back out a second time, but we're hoping in some cases to be able to negotiate those bids when they've actually gone over what the project budget can cover. So the requirements for awarding that contract to the lowest bidder, they need to be a licensed contractor. They need to be competent to perform work. And here's where some of that collected information over time from past experiences are going to be used to define whether we believe that this contractor actually is competent. We may run across a contractor that, you know, we realize we don't want to include them in our program in the future because of the work or the timeliness that they were completing. Excuse me. We want to make sure that our contractors do not have any bonds that have been called in and that they have a record of on-time completion. So we're going to be asking some questions. We're going to be screening the contractors, and those that we actually work with in our program, we're going to be collecting some information so we are able to actually look back and see what's their track record been with our program. So things that would be included in that would be thinking about what's their history of payment to subcontractors and suppliers. How many times are you getting calls from subcontractors saying, we haven't been paid? Do they have a permanent place of business? Do they appear to have adequate resources, the right equipment to be able to complete the work? Do they know what they're doing? Do they have the technical experience to be able to take on the type of scope of work that you are providing in your packets? One of the things that we're going to be completing would be a pre-construction conference. And these are really your chance to establish those lines of communication that will be used throughout that project, to identify who the contact folks would be and talk through then the scope of work. Any of those specific details that everybody involved needs to understand. Maybe this is a historic property, and with the State Historic Preservation Office, we have some specific things that have been agreed upon as part of this project. It's possible that we would have a project that was occupied, and so we had perhaps some relocation issues to be as part of that. Also, talking through those deadlines, talking through the expectations become really critical. Explaining what operating procedures would be, and so we'll be talking about things like change orders and inspection schedules, when they're eligible for a draw. All of those things will be really important as part of that pre-construction conference to have detailed, make sure that all the partners in that project will understand what the process is going to be and who they need to communicate with about any of these topics. So, you know, of course, with federal dollars in the project, we're going to have some programmatic requirements. We're going to have some federal requirements depending on the other federal requirements that are going to be triggered on that project. As we mentioned, our scope of work for rehab is also going to include things like materials and application methodologies. And so talking through what all the expectations would be important. Also clarifying the procedures. You know, if I need a change order, when I'm ready for a draw, who am I going to contact, how many days in advance, what will that process be, will be really important. Your construction contract would, of course, reference the scope of work and many of these elements. That's going to be your enforcement document. So as part of that pre-construction conference, you would want to review the elements of that contract, and then as also make sure that the subcontractors have been identified and that we have contact information for them as much as possible. If they can participate in that pre-construction meeting, that will be of a benefit. For an occupied structure, it may be as simple as talking with that homeowner we are going to be doing some work on about the scope of work and what things will need to be moved out of the way. maybe what hours work will begin and end, so they're able to plan their life accordingly. Understanding a little bit about the schedule. What are we going to be doing first? What comes later in that project will make the project go much more easily. Because we have things such as we might have lead paint remediation, hazard remediation, we might have a unit that, because of the scope of the work, we're going to temporarily have no water or heat or air conditioning. There may be issues about when that property can be occupied. Might be that we are going to temporarily have that household need to be away from that unit. And so whether it's under Uniform Relocation Act, which we'll talk about in the other federal section, or it's simply a voluntary with a homeowner rehab where we say, between 8 a.m. and 5, we're going to need full access to the unit, and during these specific time periods, there will not be, functioning water or heat or whatever. Would need to be something that would be covered and discussed and planned for as part of that pre-construction conference. As part of that, we'd be using that construction schedule, laying out what's the plan for this, when will things happen, when do we expect our subs, or other folks to be on that site, that everyone knows what the expectation is. We don't have workers kind of tripping over each other trying to work in the same space, but it's also how we're going to then try to enforce our expectations on the timeliness of moving that project forward. So that has an impact on things like, when do we need building materials to be on site? So to get them and have them available, when do they need to be ordered? Where are they going to be delivered to? Where they're going to be stored? Thinking about, the codes and standards that are going to apply. In some cases, weather is going to have a significant impact, and so we may want to think about timing on that. We also may need to think about, how we're going to protect that site during certain stages of construction and maybe the materials on that. As part of that, our development team roles and responsibilities. Who's going to be in charge of what? And that also relates to that communication plan, need to be laid out, and of course that development budget. So we can make sure we stay on budget. We're able to evaluate how we're doing. Are there any issues with that budget? So we need to talk a little bit about change orders. So change orders are triggered anytime that we have a change in that design, in the work specifications, when there's a change to that scope of work. So our project was, in most cases, going to have been procured. Folks bid on a specific scope of work, but it also could include things that might not have a financial impact, where we're changing a design, but the budget is not impacted on that. Maybe we're changing that work schedule. Anything that is going to have a change on our project, including and specifically cost changes, needs to be reflected and approved in the form of a change order. So change orders must address when there's any change to budget or the time frame for those projects. A change order is not something that can simply be implemented as an agreement between the recipient and the contractor. Change orders must be reviewed and approved by ADFA. We mentioned earlier that there's generally would be a requirement for an inspection to be able to detail why the change order was needed and the ramifications of that. Being able to anticipate those change orders as much as possible in advance will help prevent any kind of delays in a project, because you are stopping work to be able to seek approval to be able to make that change. Ways to limit our change orders. Well, we can do things including in our bidding to include unit pricing in bids. So we might have something within our bid packet that said, if let's say we're doing a roof replacement. Once we tear that roof off, we might find that the underlayment itself is in bad condition, needs to be replaced. We could have a unit pricing already included within our bid packet on what the cost would be for the replacement of that underlayment. We might have some bid alternatives within the specifications, so they'd already been priced as part of that process. We can put dollar limits, excuse me, in place for when that review is being required. Generally, our change orders are going to be done at a no profit or overhead on a change order. What we're trying to prevent from happening here is that, of course, in a case where we have a competitive procurement, the contractor that has gotten this job has gotten it by really controlling costs. And in some cases, that contractor is then going to try to either recoup when they bid too low or increase their profitability by executing as many change orders on the project as possible. And that's essentially a red flag when we begin to see those kind of change orders being executed. And sometimes that's simply an indication that they underbid and they're losing money. In other cases, it's a way to kind of try to nickel and dime the project to bring in some additional revenue. So as part of this, we keep talking about good construction management includes oversight and, kind of keeping track of the performance. So as part of this, we might be providing them some training about, look, here's the expectation, here's what's wrong with this, here's what I expect to see, how this needs to be done. In some cases where we have contractors that we're having issues with, we might place them in a probationary status and say, we're going to watch this next 1 or 2 jobs and determine whether you're going to be eligible to continue bidding on our program, because we're seeing some performance issues. If you clean these up, you will continue to be eligible to participate. Otherwise, you are going to be excluded. That puts them on notice and hopefully will, get their attention to take care of those issues. One of the techniques we can also use on this is limit the number of open jobs. And we oftentimes will see that contractors are very anxious to bid on and line up the next jobs. And sometimes that means that the jobs they already have open then slow down and kind of we have a dwindling work effort on trying to complete those. So we may need to have a limit on the number of open jobs that are allowed for specific contractors. When there are performance issues, we might require that there be a higher level of retainage that's going to be held back. We also could require them to post a higher performance bond. Now, part of our goal here is to make sure that if we can correct performance issues and have them continue as part of the program, great. Otherwise, we want to make sure that we're not going to continue to do business with them. HUD does have, the federal government has a debarment process. So when we have contractors that have serious violations, that they essentially can be blocked from any future federal contract. So we mentioned in the procurement section about using the SAMS list to review before executing contracts, and that's where we are screening to make sure, are those folks actually on that debarred list? Are they eligible for any further federal contracts? As part of managing those payments, well, we worked really diligently on trying to define what the work is, what our protocol will be on inspections on that. We need to make sure that there's some written policies and procedures in place, and we're going to review those with all the parties. That's one of the things we mentioned about as the pre-construction conference, so that they understand what needs to be in place to be eligible for a payment, what inspection will be needed, and also the timing on that. And we're going to use that, part of our tracking on progress is looking at the payments that are being processed to track the progress on completing each of those jobs. As part of our payment process, we're going to make sure that we're getting the lien waivers collected. So the subs are going to be signing a lien waiver. Sometimes suppliers are going to be signing the lien waiver to document that they, in fact, have been paid, and so this contractor is eligible for reimbursement. As sort of a safety on this, a retainage is going to be collected, 10 to 15% of each draw, which is going to be held until 30 days after all of the work has been completed and the project has been signed off on. The reason you're holding retainage, getting a contractor to come back to a project site and deal with punch list items, deal with quality issues during that construction period, the biggest incentive is that you've still got some of their money. And so retainage is going to be held on projects until that job has been completed, all those punch list items have been addressed, and only then will that retainage be allowed. So that final payment will only come after the final inspection has been completed, all the documents are in place. We have documentation that all those punch list items have been taken care of. In particular, we may have Davis Bacon, other wage rate requirements, so making sure that the final payrolls, equal opportunity data has been provided and has been accepted. So we're trying to make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row. There are no outstanding issues before we make a release of that final payment. One of the things that can be included in a project budget would be contingency funding, and this is put in place to make sure that if we have some kind of unexpected cost that has occurred, that we have adequate funding within that budget. So this is not money that's included in the budget that's simply available to that contractor at will. This is money that's been set aside that if there are change orders, that we have some additional money available to be able to use that. This is something that's necessary for our rehabilitation projects because, of course, there's some unknowns before we open up walls or tear off some materials to see what conditions might lurk underneath. That level of contingency funding that makes sense is really going to vary on the size of the project, what those unknowns are, the complexity of that project, and that's something that ADFA in reviewing the funding would make a determination on. As part of this, we want some periodic reporting, making sure that we're able to track the progress that each recipient is making on their projects, making sure that they are retaining well-trained individuals. The way we can do this is reporting on progress. That would include things like milestones that have been established. So if we've got a new construction project, we have a construction timeline that would be used as part of ADFA's approval, and then evaluating, reporting from that partner. If the expectation was that foundation would be completed by July, if it's August and it's not in, they want to know that because that project is now behind schedule. We want to make sure that actions can be taken to make sure that that project will move forward in a timely fashion, get back on schedule. As part of this, nobody wants every little detail, really a focus on things that tell us something about this project, whether it be reporting on these milestones, looking at the financial draws, but we're trying to capture what's the current status of this project. Is it on schedule? Is it being done correctly? So as part of our relationship with our partners, we can have sanctions within our contractor agreements, sanctioning when they have late work, when they get behind on their schedule, if there's inaccurate or incomplete reporting, and making sure that each of our partners are reporting back, whether that is a contractor reporting back to a subrecipient or whether it's a subrecipient reporting back to ADFA on that. So key ways to be able to do this would be things like milestone tracking. So we've established on the front end when we expect key elements of projects to be completed, and then we would have that partner report back based on where am I, where did I say I would be, where am I now, how did I get in this situation, how am I going to fix that. Also tracking financing in that way. Same thing, anything where you have an exception that's outside of what was expected. Common issues that we find with construction projects, where we get some job site tension and conflict, got a lot of moving parts, where we have contractors that aren't communicating well, or we're getting excessive involvement by that property owner, information requests. Anytime we have cost overruns or we have workmanship that is not up to our standards, we talked about an issue about change orders or projects that are delayed based on that projected timeline. And in some cases, we'll find that there's theft from the site and needing to try to figure out how do we protect materials, how do we protect equipment on that. Best ways to try to be able to control this, make sure you've got a good pool of contractors that you can depend on, that you've established a good participation with those contractors. You're keeping them happy, but you're also keeping that communication going really well. And on the front end of projects, that everybody understands what's the plan, who's doing what, when do we expect that, so that we have some pretty clear expectations on how the project will flow, how communication will be handled for that. As part of that, we want to make sure that we update everybody in the team about any changes that occur. If there are issues about workmanship or timeliness, those need to be addressed, they need to be talked about, and there needs to be a clear expectation of what the fix would be on that. As part of that, we make sure that we got feedback from all the parties on that to kind of know how things are working. So, you know, getting off to a strong start, a good construction, pre-construction meeting, making sure that we have some systems in place to be able to track the project, managing those change orders, managing the draw and payments, and also anytime we have any kind of dispute, getting in there early, working quickly to kind of get to sort of a neutral point where we can figure out what the issue is and try to resolve those disputes quickly. We have enforcement mechanisms in place, our contracts, the language that's in that, our scope of work, and then really having oversight on that to try to manage this project to make it sure it's moving forward. So keeping track of the progress, the schedule, the quality, the financially how that project is going, making sure folks are following that communication protocol that's been put in place, and making sure that the reporting that was required is also being followed. You know, this is really going to vary depending on the size of that project. We may have contractors and projects that you can visit from time to time and things will be fine. You may have larger scale projects or more complex projects that you consider to be higher risk, and that your level of oversight is going to have to be more frequent and more involved for that project. There's some forms in place to assist you as part of this process. They include an IDIS completion report. So this is where you're providing ADFA the information about this project, about the beneficiaries, which they will use as part of reporting back to HUD and showing that this project has been completed. There is a certificate of compliance for the Arkansas Energy Code. There are sample bid packets and bid tabulations. We talked about in the procurement section about tabulating those bids as they're being opened. And then there are standards for an agenda and a report for the pre-construction conference for the notice to proceed that would be issued, the change order forms and punch list forms, and then of course the certificate of final completion for each of those projects. There is a final contractor estimate that can be used There's a release of lien form that would be used for each contractor and also for each of our subcontractors. And then, of course, keep in mind, there's a form for verification of contractor eligibility. We mentioned the sam.gov system to make sure that we were not issuing any contracts to contractors who were on the federal debarred list. All of these forms are available at adfa.arkansas.gov and would need to be utilized and held as part of your filing system for each of your projects.